Welcome to another edition of the Best Business Minds, where we interview business leaders and academics that write thought-provoking books. I'm Marc Kramer, serial entrepreneur who consults with family businesses and entrepreneurs. This is our 149th show. Today's guest is Donna Kennedy-Glans, author of Teaching Dinosaurs to Dance, which I love the title. That's what attracted me to the book. So Donna, let's get started by you telling us about your professional background.
Thank you, Mark. I'm actually a lawyer, trained as a lawyer, but I've certainly morphed over time. I started working in oil companies when I was very, very young, did that for many years, worked in the 35 countries, negotiating deals, marketing oil, doing all the things that you do in the 80s and the 90s and early 2000s. Was invited by women in Yemen after I had left one big oil company, and was invited there to train women in healthcare and law and journalism, and set up a nonprofit to do that in the country of Yemen. Did that for roughly a decade, and then had to leave because of Al-Qaeda. And that nonprofit now works with First Nations youth here in Canada and diaspora youth. I then went into politics. I'm certainly a boundary hopper. I went into politics, became a provincial politician in the province where I live in Alberta, Canada, and became Minister of Electricity and Renewable Energy in 2013, 14. Then I have now moved into writing. I'm a political commentator. I do a lot of writing, write a column for a national Canadian newspaper, interviewing people, and write a blog called Beyond Polarity. And I'm probably more of a community activist or agitator or commenter at this point in time.
When you're a politician, is that like similar to our state representatives if you're working? So you're not on the national basis, you were strictly in your province?
I was in my province. In Canada, provinces have responsibility for things like energy, which is a bit different than the United States. So our constitution is structured a little bit differently. So yes, that's exactly what was happening.
Awesome. And you were in Iraq and Afghanistan, or just Iraq?
I wasn't ever in Iraq, but it's one of the very few Middle Eastern countries that I haven't worked in. I've worked all over North Africa, West Africa, Central Africa, Middle East, Asia, any emerging democracy. I think I've been there negotiating some sort of transaction, and a lot of Latin America. So that was my job for decades, and I've continued in different capacities, not just commercial at this point in time.
When was the last time you were in Afghanistan?
Would have been just before they were having all the attacks on women. I was actually supposed to go in, I think 2009, and the person I was supposed to be meeting and working with was actually murdered just before I was to depart, so I didn't depart. It's tough. There are some really, really, really tough places in the world, and bearing witness might be one thing, but it's really hard work to figure out how to support some people in those places. I spend a lot of time thinking about that and actually working on it.
Well, I'm glad you've stepped up in the way you have done in your career. Why did you write this book?
I wrote this book because I was really concerned about how I was seeing people respond to COVID. I don't think COVID created a lot of the problems that we're facing today, but I think it aggravated them. And I saw a lot of people that I care about, whether they were running a nonprofit or running a company or even in government, just freeze. I saw them cocoon and just kind of protect themselves. And it's like they lost sight of what they were supposed to do. And I saw other people with great anxiety. They just saw so many asteroids heading their way, and they were just overwhelmed by them. So I wanted to write a book to say, hey, I get it. I know that you're facing all these challenges, and we all are. There are ways through this. And frankly, if you just stay frozen and don't do anything, and think that that's okay, you're not going to survive this. 21st century arrived just about the same time as COVID, in fact, in the ways that it manifested. And people have to figure out a path through, and that's what this was about, was helping people figure out a path through all the chaos and not stay in that stuck place.
So drinking's not the answer here.
Well, it is some days.
Yeah.
Yeah,
You
self-medicating, yes.
Yeah, I think we all did a lot of that. You write this book. You write this book is for enterprise rebuilders and new builders. How do you define these two types of people, and what skill sets do they need?
Yes, we talked about rebuilding enterprise because that's what we're kind of forced to do right now. We have to actually figure out how we're going to do this differently because the old rules don't work. And so you've got generations who are doing business right now. I'm a baby boomer. I'm 63, 62, and I'm one of those people who could be categorized as a dinosaur, the hey boomer thing. Really, you're going to tell me how to do this? I think there's a lot in that. We need to pay attention to it. So if I'm a boomer, how do I talk to somebody who's Gen X, who's right in the heart of this right now, carrying the weight of commerce on their shoulders? They're making most of the decisions right now. Boomers are advising. Some people are retired, some aren't, but they're phasing out, not in a bad way, in a good way. And what's that role look like? Gen X's, under the gun, got to make decisions, got to make this work. And then you've got the millennials, people who are, I would say, the new builders. They haven't got a lot of experience with leading or making significant decisions. They're at the table now, which is great, but they're not the lead decision makers. And then you have the generations following them. So how does this all knit together? So I use the motif of a dinosaur because I come from Alberta, where there are lots of dinosaurs and not just in the oil patch. And I've got this grouchy old dinosaur Rex that I use on TikTok. And he's kind of the dinosaur. And it's all of us, when we are kind of stuck in our thinking and we think we can know how to tell somebody, do it this way because I've done it this way. And, that's the answer. And then you've got Figment, the enlightened dinosaur, the woke dinosaur, who's kind of like the new builder, who's got fresh ideas, a different way of seeing things. And somehow we've got to talk. And so that's what a lot of this is about, is rebuilders. If you've done this before, you've seen crisis, you've worked through it. Yes, you have experience, but some of that experience isn't useful right now. And what is, and how do you make sure that you pass on what's useful to the next generation? And the next generations who are making the decisions, or, in the wings, how do you listen in a way and ask the right questions so that you get answers and don't just blow them off? Like, you can't blow off the dinosaurs. You have to teach them how to dance. You have to do a tango. It's not an easy tango, putting somebody together who's got really stuck ways of thinking and somebody who's got really, really forward thinking and progressive. It's a tango, it's a dance. So how are you going to do that? I talk a lot about that in the book.
Yeah, I know, and you and I are the same age. I don't know if it has so much to do with age as how people's perspective, if they're open-minded, because you meet young people who are inflexible as well and don't like change. And those of us who are intellectually interested in lots of stuff, we find that we embrace the change and welcome young people's perspective, and often ask them for advice and ask them questions. And
Curiosity.
Curiosity. I think that's
curiosity is a big feature. Yeah.
Yeah. What should the composition of boards be made up of to enhance the company's chances and abilities to reinvigorate the company? Because so many boards are comprised of friends of the leader and or investors, often little experience in the area that they're of the company.
It feels really comfortable when you're chairing a board. I've chaired boards, and it feels really comfortable when you look around the table and you know everybody and you know kind of what they're going to say, and they're rooting for you. You know that they're rooting for you and your organization. That's a good feeling, except it doesn't work. And the opposite end of that, we've got in Canada in particular, and I know you've got it going on in the United States, we've got pushes where we've got nonprofit organizations that have done this diversity, inclusion, and equity strategy where they clean house. They just get rid of the whole board and replace it with diversity candidates overnight. I have seen that happen, and it is such a train wreck. It's not even good intentions. It's kind of knee jerk, in my opinion. So I've been responsible on boards for getting new candidates, diversity candidates, and it's really challenging. The last board I was on, we very much needed somebody on board because with accounting experience, because our chief financial, wizard on the board was retiring. And I got all this pressure to get somebody who was Black and, from a disadvantaged background, maybe Indigenous, if you can find somebody, Donna, and they needed accounting experience. Well, by the time you try to get into that little wedge piece, you've got so few candidates to choose from. It's impossible. And those candidates are being, courted by everybody else who's looking for board members. So I kind of went back to the board and I said, well, of course we need all those things, but we can't do it in this particular appointment. So let's be more flexible. Lots of controversy, lots of different opinions, but you got to work through it. And I would just say it's got to be intentional. You need diversity of thinking as much as anything else. And mandates are, I'm mixed on mandates. And I'm of an age where a female mandate would have really helped me in business, but it kind of didn't. It kind of works against you too. So I'm very mixed on how to make these things formal. I like that companies like Coca-Cola went out and said to their lawyers, law firms, look, we want some female lawyers on our files and we want to see that. So I think those kind of influences are very effective and send a message, but I guess somewhere in the happy medium of don't do it all overnight and do something, because if you just got people who think like you are not going to be fresh. You're not going to be able to handle new ideas. You're not going to see them. You're going to have blind spots that you haven't dealt with.
Amazing. That's just common sense, right? I mean, when you think about it, and every study Harvard's done on this subject has shown that the return on investment is like ridiculously better than having the same homogeneous group
Right.
without any diversity. But when you have diverse group, everybody has different experiences, life, business, everything. And that adds to solving the problem and coming up with new ideas. And it's just common sense. But forever, like you said in the beginning, people get comfortable with a certain group and they rather just look in for comfort and for control because they know that those people will vote along with them. I've been on plenty of boards too. And I once had a famous CEO that I wanted to bring on, and the board was totally opposite. Didn't want to bring him on. I said, why? They said, he's too much of a Boy Scout. He's not controllable. And I thought, oh my God, he's a world famous guy. Turns out I asked him, he said, nobody ever asked him to be on the board for that reason. Which was very unfortunate. He was a very ethical guy. I can say now, Jack Bogle, who founded Vanguard, because he's passed.
Wow.
As the pandemic is in our rearview mirror, how has that changed companies' views of innovation, customer and talent acquisition?
Oh, I think it's upended a lot of strategies, and people are now just digesting that. So innovation's a big one. I think a lot of companies had to innovate to survive. So they did things they never even thought possible. And I think some of it now is sorting through that to see what sticks. So let me give you an example. Cirque du Soleil, everyone's seen a Cirque du Soleil show. They're fantastic. Comes out of Quebec in Canada. And they were doing live shows in Vegas, live shows all over the country, all over North America. Was great. During COVID, they had to figure out what they were going to do. They had all these people who were primed to do this work and needed jobs and they needed revenue. So what they did was they went virtual. And now their virtual programming is just as exciting as their on the ground face-to-face stuff. So I think a lot of organizations had the chance to experiment with virtual and see how it worked. Educational institutions had the same opportunity, especially post-secondary. And I think a lot of, people who were doing, I mean, it's trite to say it now, everybody doing bricks and mortar is now doing online. How did that work out? Who's going to go back? I think it was a really amazing big experiment, very tough to be on the, facing those questions. But I think people really, really rose to the challenge, or else they withered and died. And we saw lots of that too. In terms of customers, I think what we saw with people like, I think Amazon to me is the company that deals with customers more clearly than anybody else, any other organization out there. Customers are their number one priority, full stop. Nobody else comes close. And I think for a lot of organizations, they had to figure out where the customer fit in. And I think there's probably been some reordering of priorities of stakeholders. And that's not a bad thing either. I think the customer, like Lego, for example, their customers are kids. I think they're brilliant. They go out to kids. I've got 3 sons and they're all adults now. But our youngest is an engineer. And when he was a kid, he loved Lego. Like he would design stuff and send pictures to Lego. And Lego is smart enough to know that that's where they get new ideas. So they go out and ask kids, you create stuff. And they build what kids want. That's brilliant. Talent acquisition and retention. I think this has been really tricky and really hard. During COVID, a lot of places where mentorship was really important. And back to the rebuilders and the new builders, how did companies train new trainees? How did they recruit them? Lawyers in law firms, accountants in accounting firms, people in an IT division. How did you keep them up to date? How did you guide them in not just the technical training, but in the subtleties of exercising judgment? When to ask a question, what's the right question to ask? If you just said, I can't do any of that, we're in COVID, we're all virtual, it's impossible for me to do that, then those people really lost out, and so did your company. So one of the questions I ask people all the time, everybody, is what did you do during COVID? How did you do during COVID? And I think those answers are remarkable. They actually are testimony to how people are wired. Did they rise up and go beyond? My husband is a financial guy, and he has this team of people, 10 dozen people. Every day during COVID, they got together virtually at 9 o'clock in the morning. You didn't have to be there, but you could be there. And most of them were there every single day to kind of do a check-in, casual, informal. Are you okay? What kind of questions are you asking? How are you coping with this? And it wasn't just, people had little kids. They had to deal with those questions. So it became an ongoing safe place for them to ask questions and for mentorship, real mentorship to happen. So for me, I think that transition to younger people is about how do we mentor virtually, face-to-face, and actually really get to some honest questions and answers, just like we should be doing at a board table, creating a culture where that's okay.
No question about it. And I think that we're seeing companies are going to try to have a balance between people working from home and working away. I've been working with commercial property owners around the country. And of course, they're trying to get people to come back in because otherwise they're going to have a lot of empty property and eventually they go under. But one of the things that they've been encouraging is telling companies, are you looking to build corporate cultures and groom people for success, or are they just doing jobs for you? Yeah. And so the companies are also asking the same question of people. Are you want a job or do you want a career? Because if you want just a job, yeah, you can work from home and you'll get your yearly raise. But if you want a career and move up, we need to get to know you, and we can't know you without you being in person, where we bump into you and just have conversations where we're not just arranging things on Zoom. So and now with all these companies letting people go, the power is going to shift back again to the
Right.
companies, right? And
Right.
they're going to say, no, we want you here. Some people don't ever need to come in, but for the most part, I think people are going to see it a little bit differently. Polarity has become a huge problem for countries, businesses, and families. We see this every day, especially here in the US. When each side can't understand why the other side doesn't embrace their position, how do you think that can be solved? Because it's literally tearing apart the world.
I think it's one of the biggest challenges facing us, and a lot of it can be blamed on social media. And I'm reading a book right now called The Chaos Machine, which is about the impact of social media. It's by a New York Times writer. It is shocking how we're being manipulated, but I think the part of the answer to polarity is acknowledging that you are being manipulated. I mean, we've always had advertising; it's been there forever, but this is at a scale we've never seen before. So if you're being drawn into a side, got to pick a side, got to be this or that, got to be pro-vaccination or anti-vaccination, and we've had all sorts of stuff going on in Canada. We even had a truck convoy in Ottawa, and
Yeah, I watched on TV.
weeks of rioting, protesting around that. But the question, when I say to people, and I've been probing this question for a very long time because I've worked in a lot of polarizing situations. I'm a Western woman with blonde hair and blue eyes working in the Middle East. I mean, what's that all about? It's very polarizing. It could be. So what's the common ground? Early days, that's what we used to look at was what do we have in common? But I think today it's a little bit different. I think we have to be clear that we are being manipulated. I am being manipulated on Facebook. My algorithm is being manipulated. So what I say to people, and I blog about this all the time on a blog called beyondpolarity.blog. I care a lot about this question, is just acknowledge it. And if it's an issue you really care about and you need to stand your ground on, you actually need to look people in the eye and say, look, I get it. I know you're emotional about this question. Whether it's a relative at a table or a person across the board table, but I got to tell you, I'm not going there with you. I'm not picking a side on this question. I think that there are still gray elements here, and I choose to be vaccinated because my granddaughter is in the hospital. That's my choice. But I'm not here to debate with you. I'm not getting drawn into this. And I think what's happening with a lot of the stuff we're seeing with, DeSantis and the Governor DeSantis and companies like Disney is it's becoming polarized because they both pick sides and now they're locked in. It's interesting and very troubling actually to watch how companies get drawn into these things. Back to the dinosaur. I mean, dinosaurs get stuck, and if you sit in that stuck place, it's really hard to dislodge yourself. Climate change was one of those topics that's incredibly polarized, and I work in the energy sector and have for a long time. I understand hydrocarbons really well. I've worked in that space. But I also understand the role of renewable energy. I understand the role of hydrogen. I understand we need to have a transition. There is an evolution going on. People will pick different strategies. I need to have those conversations, but I can't have them if somebody's saying, well, I don't believe in climate change and I'm not having this conversation. So I think we need to be really frank about this. Stop with the manipulation. I'm not going there. If you want to have a conversation, these are the ground rules. This is what it can look like. It's a really important conversation. I think it's worth our effort, even if we don't like each other. And I also think we need to accept that there is conflict. There's no namby-pamby. This is not about being Pollyanna and being nice. I think you can be direct and clear and not be mean, but you got to be in that space. Like this is just deal with it. I think it's a proactive measure.
Yeah, and people avoid the facts. Look, just again, another common sense issue. Climate change, it's real because, hey, there's 4 billion people more on the planet 100 years later than there were at the start of the last century. So it's just common sense would tell you that. But people still want to ignore that this is the case. And now we even have all these satellite pictures. I mean, it's proof on a daily basis. You can't ignore it. you've got to head it on. And we're smart, people are smart. They always find ways around fixing those problems. So I got to believe that that's going to be the case. So you talk about enterprise onion. And I love the graphic that you had in the book. It has about 5 layers. Please tell us what those layers are and how they impact the company with a real world example, which you list in the book.
Absolutely. We're really comfortable with talking about, well, we're not comfortable enough, but we are getting there, talking about how we invite opinions with internal teams. How do you get, your employees to have an opinion, listen to it, your board, your different suppliers, people who are close to us. We're really kind of have ways of engaging. But when we get out of our circle, our inner circle, and try to talk to people who are outside of our control, and I think you've referenced that already, and it's a little bit dangerous, but there's a value in doing that because they can cover off our blind spots, and actually maybe they want to align with us. So I created this onion, and it's got layers of the inner circle. So that core is our internal management team and leadership team. And then if we go out one ring to like-minded people, probably our suppliers, some of people in the same business who are aligned like us, we know that they're going to think like us, and we're probably pretty safe that they're going to say, yeah, that's a really good idea, or maybe tweak it a little bit. The risk with just going that far and outreach in the onion is that you end up with confirmation bias. You're listening to people who think like you. So I encourage companies to go a little further, at least, and go to the next layer, which is talking to people who are open-minded. They're not necessarily going to agree with you. They're not within your control. They're a little bit out of your comfort zone. Maybe they're your competitor. Maybe they're a technical expert who has some other view, an independent view on something. Maybe it's a community where you're going to invest, and you're gonna, they're open to the idea of you investing there, but you need to hear from them about exactly how they perceive what you're doing. And the next 2 layers of the onion are a little bit less comfortable, and a lot of companies don't go here, but there are times when you need to. So then the 4th layer of the onion is talking to the skeptical. These are people who may be not happy with you, and they're already a little bit squishy about what you're doing. Maybe they're disgruntled clients. Maybe there's somebody who has a different view than you on climate change. They don't see eye to eye with you. They're not going to knock you down flat, but you know that you're going to have to prove your point with them. There are times when it's a smart thing to do that because it tests your ideas. You're going to get tested on some of your ideas anyway. You may as well do it in advance. And the final group that is very difficult to talk to are the cynical. If I'm working with an oil company, am I going to go talk to Greenpeace about, a bank saying, we're not going to invest in the oil sands or oil anymore? That's a testy conversation. It's probably intractable. It's probably polarized. But is there a value in developing that relationship? Is it possible? That's a very valid question. Sometimes it's not. But there are times when companies are wise to go and have that conversation in some way, shape, or form. And sometimes it's the new builders that are better at having that conversation than the older builders or the rebuilders or the people who are a little more fixed in their thinking. So figuring out who should have that conversation in your organization is really, really important. So again, the layers, your internal team is your core, like-minded, open-minded, skeptical, and cynical. And I use the onion I like images. I'm a visual learner. So you just put it on the table. Like, who have we talked to? I would sit down with pipeline companies and I would say to them, they were getting blocked and, building a pipe somewhere. And I'd say, well, tell me who you've talked to. And I put the onion on the table. And they've talked to a million people in the, the like-minded and even the open-minded space. But have they talked to anybody who's skeptical? Not really. Have they talked to anybody who's cynical? Oh, not a chance. So I challenge them. Go talk to somebody who doesn't agree with you. and tell me what that conversation looks like, because you're going to learn from that. And it's probably going to open your eyes up to some of the ways that people are perceiving things. I mean, people, especially if they're not familiar with the sector, they're not going to understand your language. They're not going to understand what you're trying to do, and they're not going to believe you. So you need to build an authentic relationship if you can, and sometimes you can't, but if you can, you need to talk about it. So it's a graphic, but I find it really helpful. I've used it on the back of envelopes and the back of napkins all the time.
I loved it. That's why I had to mention it. I like the whole chapter on it. How do you define core values, and does a CEO present them? How does a CEO present them in an authentic way? Because we often see these listed core values and all, roll our eyes and say it's bullshit. They don't really believe in it themselves. So how do you define core values, and how do you suggest CEOs present it so people think it's real?
I think authenticity is one of the great things that people are looking for right now. They want to see real politicians. They want to see real corporate leaders. They just want to see people get past the bullshit and stop with espousing the same old rhetoric. It doesn't land. It may sound really good and it's safe. It is safe, but it doesn't work. And in fact, I think it actually compromises how people perceive what you really are about. So I'm going to point to some examples that are, what are the values of Occidental Petroleum? Now, I'm interested in that because I worked for a subsidiary of Occidental Petroleum in Canada, Canadian Occidental. We ended up going independent, so it's an interesting trajectory, but I saw the company up close, and I'm watching them now as they talk to President Biden and they talk to people about what's our value. It is clear that the value of Occidental Petroleum right now is to make money and make profit for shareholders. That's a huge value for them. Yes, they want to be there for the longer term, and yes, they care about the environment and climate change, but right now their big value is money for shareholders. So is that a terrible thing? No, it's not a terrible thing. Lots of companies exist for the primary purpose of making money for shareholders. It's not how I might run my company, but it is how some people run their company. That's authentic. We've seen lots of companies make statements about, net zero. I'm going to be net zero. Our company's going to be net zero by 2035 or 2040. If they do not have a plan for how to do that, I don't care what you say. I don't believe you. And I think, excuse me, I think it's just rhetoric. So it's, for me, when I'm looking for authenticity, excuse me, I'm looking for a CEO can say, this is a value that's meant a lot to us for a very long time, as demonstrated by these actions, and we're going to do these things in the future to manifest that value. And this is how we're going to do it. And this is how we're going to measure it. And if we can't achieve that, and we're going to course correct in this way, that's real. That's what I'm looking for.
It's funny. I was teaching at a university when Donald Trump ran against Hillary Clinton, and 80% of my students felt that Donald Trump was authentic. He is who he is, whether you like it or not. That's who he is. And they didn't feel Hillary was authentic, and so 80% of my students were voting for Trump. They weren't necessarily happy a year later, but that's why they voted for him. So authentic, right, can go many different ways.
Yeah, I mean, there are great examples out there. Another one is, I've been watching Coca-Cola really closely with Black Lives Matter. That's another one I would flag for people.
What's the difference between environmental, social, and governance, ESG, and corporate social responsibility, CSR? And should that be part of a CEO's compensation equation?
Oh, wonderful question. I grew up with I didn't grow up with corporate social responsibility. In my early days in my career, environmental protection was an issue, but we didn't talk about social responsibility of companies. So yes, I am a dinosaur. social responsibility became a thing when companies going abroad and investing in countries and have causing all sorts of havoc and damage, human rights issues. I was in the thick of that. I was working for companies who were trying to deal with that and respond to that. We had no framework to do it, and we didn't have any clarity about what our expectations were. So we actually had to define them. That was, advocates were telling us what to do. It was all over the place. It was really sloppy and messy and vague and altruistic. I worked for a company where we set up a scholarship program in the country of Yemen and identified high school students across the country, 100 of them, and brought them to Canada to train. These people had, huge barriers to entry. There was no guarantee of success. It was an audacious thing to do. It was one of the projects I was responsible for. But we did it because we thought it was our social responsibility. I write about that in the book because I think it was a step too far. For our competencies, it worked, but it only worked by chance. And I'm glad it worked, but it may have gone really bad. So corporate responsibility is amorphous. It was just a bundle of issues and advocates trying to rally to define what companies should be doing. And it was very blurry. ESG, I find to be very, it's more guided by materiality. It's more guided by financial people. It's coming from banks. It's coming from financial institutions. And they're saying, these are the criteria we're looking at. They're measurable. We're watching it. We're going to determine whether we're going to give you money or not based on how you perform. They are setting the measures. Companies are doing it internally, but certainly influenced by those kinds of third parties and dependencies. And tying it to CEO salaries, absolutely. We're seeing that happen all over the place. We're seeing it tied to loan conditions. So it's a thing. It's real. It's alive. Some people call it woke. I think we'll get to that, I'm sure. But I think it's got a lot more discipline than what we had in the past. And I appreciate that a lot.
How do you define enterprise value? Because I think it's always a big question what people look at as real enterprise value.
Well, I mean, there's the simple answer that it's your financial value, and that's what's your stock price at. That's easy, and it changes from time to time. But I ask people to really look hard at what constitutes value for your company, and I think right now, coming out of COVID, we have to look at things differently. There are lots of, you alluded to it already, Mark, there are lots of buildings that are vacant. Downtown Calgary, where I live, there are over 1 million people in this city. Downtown was one of those big skyscraper downtowns, a little bit like Houston, miniature Houston, a little Houston. Over 30% of that office space is now vacant. So if you're a company or you're trying to decide what's the value of having building space, and what's the value of unutilized capacity, and what am I going to do with that? This is the time to be asking those questions. Amazon, what do they value? They value profit, but they also value their customers, and they place great value on that. You alluded earlier to the question of loyalty, responsibility to mentor younger people. How do people value loyalty? Is it something that your employees value, but you don't value, or your employees not value it? And then I think that whole gig experience, and we did a lot of gig work during the COVID experience. What is the value of loyalty? Because I think that's a huge value for most organizations, and they've kind of blown it off. I think we're going to come around to different ideas there. We've talked about the value of having a financial cushion during a time of rising interest rates, a financial cushion during the time of COVID. How much financial cushion do you need? Where's your risk points? The value of not being dependent on somebody calling in your loan. I come from a farming community. That's a huge question. How much independence do you have? Do you have to sell at this price or not? Do you have choices? The value of high-speed internet to a country, to a company, to a community. I think that has changed in the last little while. During COVID, if you didn't have high-speed internet, how did you teach your kids? How did you connect with people at home? I've been on lots of calls that have been really choppy. It's very, very burdensome to not have access to high-speed internet, but that's got a different value than it had, I would suggest, before COVID. The value of an Arctic military strategy is we've got balloons drifting in from the north. I mean, that's certainly something the United States is scrambling to answer, and Canada alongside, although I worry about, I think we are alongside. I think we are very dependent on the United States strategy here. But I think those are the kinds of questions, the value of a cybersecurity strategy in a time when we're having more of that kind of activity and being prepared. So I think value is a really big word. Values is a really big word too, and the two don't equate, but there's a correlation. I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, I agree with you. Many once powerful companies like Wang Laboratories, Sears, Blockbuster no longer exist. What can we learn by their failures, and what stopped them from course correcting? Because, my gosh, Blockbuster could have bought Netflix for, a small amount of money, and Wang Laboratories owned corporate America when it came to word processing and other things. And is picking the wrong person to lead unmovable and an unmovable culture, is that part of the problem and why these companies failed?
Oh, these are great questions and sad stories, all of them. I mean, Sears just kind of was one of those companies that withered away and died. It just kind of imploded rather than a spectacular end. It just kind of died. It got stuck in its old ways. No refreshed leadership. Couldn't see their blind spots. And that was a company, frankly, that when I was a kid, we used to order things from the Sears catalog.
Everybody
should have,
yeah.
Yeah, they were way ahead of the curve and they lost it all. So big loss on their part. Blockbuster, the adage, you're only one innovation away from being obsolete. That's a very nasty example of that, but they didn't see it. Why didn't they see it? Did they not see themselves in that business? What kind of business did they see themselves in? I think when you've got a leader who cannot see what business you're in or what the possibilities are and constrains that vision by picking like-minded people or not even allowing those conversations, you just lose all that opportunity. I think it's a loss of opportunity more than anything else. And Wang Laboratories, I mean, gaining an increased share of a shrinking market and word processing, I mean, that's a really big problem. Yes, we're successful. We're going to get more of that market, but the market itself is on decline. Who doesn't see that? Well, do your competitors see it? Do your employees see it? Are you hiring new hires who could possibly have different insights? Back to that enterprise onion. Who are you talking to about what's possible? I think it's one of the problems we've got right now. It's a big problem is we've got so much data out there. We're just overwhelmed. I could read newspapers all day long and still not keep up. And people, you just can't cope with that. You can't do your work and then, constantly absorb all this data. And we can turn some of this stuff over to AI, and I think we will be. I actually think we are already. But the bigger question, I think, for people, is what is the question? What questions are you asking? Are you asking the right questions? Are you asking best questions? And that's something I drill into people when I talk to them all the time is what are better questions that you could be asking? Because you cannot possibly keep answering all the questions that you're answering right now, and it's really not getting you anywhere. So lots to learn here, but exciting too. I mean, there are ways through this.
I mean, it's really incredible. When you think of Smith Corona, they should have still remained a giant. And BlackBerry, who didn't have a BlackBerry, was part of the lexicon, BlackBerry. And yet, I think also when folks, I'm in a venture now in the metaverse, and it's part of its gaming online, and casinos are against it because they have such a big investment in infrastructure. And I think when people have a big capital investment, they're like, I don't want any change. I mean, just like Kodak had this big investment in film processing, but you used one digital camera, you realized film was obsolete. I mean, it's just silly that they didn't realize it. So this is where we're at. We have a question from the audience. What do you see as aspects of ESG that will negatively affect companies and the markets?
Oh, I think we've got a really good angle. I think we've got good idea of on the environmental side. I think climate change is still a little bit squishy, and what do we expect companies to do to get to net zero is being defined as we speak, and what is possible, I think, is a really big question. Social, I think, has always been very difficult to get your arms around. I think defining the role of a company beyond, doing the business that it's doing, what is your role to add social value, to deal with human rights, to do something, to save the world, as some of the Silicon Valley folks would have us believe, and believable. I think that's a really squishy area that has not yet been defined, and I think there's a lot of disbelief there. But to be honest with you, the area where I find the most discord and still a lot of muting is governance. I think people are afraid still often to speak up when they need to speak up, and they won't step into the space. And back to the polarity, they're just not stepping into the space and saying, wait a minute, like, I'm calling this. They kind of go along and get along and try to build consensus. And I think it's often not working. I think how decisions get made is still a really troubling question for a lot of organizations.
Yeah, and a few people dominating the conversation and don't want other input really in. I mean, how many times have you heard people who worked at large corporations where CEO said, we want original thinkers, but they're winking their eye and don't want any original thinking to happen, just people to follow their lead. You wrote about some of Google's employees joining a union, something that's extremely rare among Silicon Valley companies. Do you see this as a growing trend, and are uber-rich companies carrying really hundreds of billions of dollars being good stewards of their employees if they feel so shortchanged that forming a union is the only way they can rectify the situation?
I think the pendulum swung on this, and I think President Biden in the United States, very overtly saying he is supportive of unions, has changed the culture around this and has given space for unionization. Starbucks, a lot of retail employees, hospitality sector, where there are huge shortages of workers, they've got influence now that they hadn't in the past. And they were really asked to do a lot during COVID. They took risks that a lot of people didn't have to take, and they did take it. The people filling grocery shelves took a lot of risk. We asked a lot of them. And now I think we're seeing some of the results of that. The Nomadland documentary that won awards was a really chilling insight into what goes on in some of the Amazon warehouses, and the whole unionization push and the pushback there. So I think it got enlivened during COVID, and we're seeing some of that go forward. But I equally think that if there was a political change, I think you'd see a switch. I think this one is a really sensitive piece, and I think it depends a lot on the political mood of a place.
There's a part of the book where you talk about monocultures. Please explain what a monoculture is and why that can be bad for your company.
So I grew up on a farm. Anybody who looks out at a field and sees year after year the same crop being built, hundreds and hundreds of acres of soybeans or canola or corn, and nobody switches it up, and it's just all one crop. And if that crop fails for any reason, you're sunk. Like, that's what a monoculture is. A monoculture in a company, if you're an engineering company, you got to hire engineers. So you're going to be recruiting engineers, and engineers tend to be trained the same way. And a lot of them, they're analytical in their thinking. That's why they go into engineering. And these are gross overgeneralizations. I'm not trying to offend anybody. But in nursing, there is a type of a person who is attracted to nursing. So if you've got an environment in your organization that is a natural monoculture, you need to pay attention to that, because back to the diversity of thinking, have you got people who think differently? So I find that we've got a lot of monocultures being created, and polarization is also creating monocultures. It's creating blocks of interest. But those little monocultures, like feminism is really, you think it's not a safe word anymore. I'm a white female. Do I have a different view of feminism than a Black female, or a transgendered female, or an indigenous female, or a rural female, or an urban female? And now we've got monocultures, but they're being broken down into little subcultures. So there's just a lot of, there's divisions and there's fragmentations happening. So I'm kind of looking at that whole question from two angles. One is the question of, do you have enough diversity of thinking in your organization, or do you just have one monoculture? And then the polarization impact of putting us into camps and little and smaller and smaller and smaller boxes that fight with each other. It's something to pay attention to.
You've talked about this throughout this conversation. Many companies aren't meeting their acceptable diversity percentages, which means different things to different people. How did you define diversity, and what should companies be striving for?
It's a really tricky question, describing diversity. If you get into race theory, there's one way of looking at diversity. There are, really, really vague definitions of diversity, which mean, it's not just skin color or sexual orientation or race. It's about your way of thinking. I like to look at diversity. I like to actually unpack the whole thing at the table with the people who are going to be deciding on, what are our new hires going to look like? What kind of leadership do we need? What's our board going to look like? And looking at what the criteria is that we're trying to achieve and why we're trying to achieve it. What's the purpose of that particular target? Then the question of whether you're explicit about it or not, and what's the trajectory to get there. It can't happen overnight. This stuff can't happen overnight, or you're going to be doing things that will be very hard to implement and integrate with the rest of your organization. I've worked with nonprofits where they wanted to, again, I've mentioned this overnight, go to a BIPOC board, or a BIPOC, we're hiring, everybody that we hire is going to be Black, Indigenous, or a person of color. And that's just the way it is. What is the message to everybody else who's got the qualifications to do the job? I think that's a really harsh message, and you're limiting your options. We're seeing educational institutions do this a lot right now, and it's backfiring. They're losing out. Some of those people that would have applied aren't applying because they think they're already out of the race. So I think this really needs to be unpacked at the table.
As you write, there are cynics who are really against socially progressive organizations, virtue signaling and using woke capital. Are they on the wrong side of this as it's related to maximizing profits, creating greater shareholder and stakeholder value?
Oh, I think Milt Friedman would be quite happy with people like DeSantis and the people who are going after woke capital. There was a day when a company existed to make money, and that was it, the end. I think that day is long over, and I think that most of people in society would say that that's the case. So the question is, how do you define your accountability to other stakeholders, your employees, the community, the public, the consumer? What's your obligation, and how are you going to manifest that? How far are you going to go? So Coca-Cola, as an example, during the Black Lives Matter, as soon as the Black Lives Matter issue arose, they were on board because they'd already had the experience with Rodney King. They already, as a company, had exercised that muscle. They knew what they had to do. They allied with like-minded organizations, like-minded and some open-minded, and they said, we're on this. We're totally behind the idea of Black Lives Matter. And they got in there and they did clear things. But their cynics said, you're just doing this to make money. It's probably true, but that's actually, they had done it in the past. They had a clear path for how they were going to do it. Where Coca-Cola got tripped up was when the governors in Georgia, were starting to deal with laws about election, and company and their consumers were saying to Coca-Cola, and their partners and their allies were saying, well, you need to get on board with this because you need to speak up about not just Black Lives Matter, but this state legislation over in Georgia. And they choked. Coca-Cola choked. They didn't come out and say something right away. Ultimately, they did, but it was kind of too late, and it felt like a little bit weird, and it didn't feel aligned to what they really were saying. So I think we've got virtue signaling is a really tricky thing. I think there is a sweet spot in all of this. Companies cannot be all things. You can't fix all the social problems in the world. Even if you're a big company, you can't do that. But you can't stand by and say, we're here to do good, and then stand by and watch. I'm going to use Facebook as an example. Watch all the craziness go on, knowing that you're part of the problem and pretending that you're not. No, it's absolutely unacceptable. So I think this one is really tough. It's where different leadership skills are being required. And I think that's something important for companies too, is what new leadership skills do we need to be able to survive in a world where that's the kind of question we're going to be asked. Are we woke or not woke? What are we going to do? What do you do when one of your senior employees speaks out on social media in your community about transgender operations? You gotta be ready for this. It's going to happen whether you expect it or not, but you can't be all things to all people. And so I think it's a real look at your values, be prepared, be smart, and be agile.
I wonder what you think universities, as I mentioned, I taught the Wharton School. What should schools like Wharton and Harvard and McGill be teaching young leaders about these issues, and how should they groom them to have an open mind and balance these things out, because you can't go too far one way or the other?
I think it's really difficult because they often kind of pick a side, and I think that's a problem. We're a progressive place of education, and so woke is embedded in all the decision making that's around them. That's actually really difficult, because in the real world, are you going to be the most productive company and survive through all these challenges if you are picking people who are, they check off your BIPOC criteria, but they don't meet the other needs that you have? On the other hand, if you ignore it all and blow it off and say, I'm with DeSantis, I'm just about making money, there aren't very many companies that can survive doing that these days. Some do, but I think the balance is required, and fine tuning it based on the individual company that you're with is really, really important. These are serious conversations, and these get right to the gut for people. And that's back to the dinosaur thing. I worked with lots of people who believe that it's about making money. And if you're not financially stable, then all the rest is just noise. And that's valid. And I've been with companies, I've seen companies go bankrupt, and it's really hard. It's a big, hard thing to do. But there's got to be a dialogue. For me, it's, I say to them, your reputation has a value. What are things worth? Back to, value questions. When you do these things, you send a message to people that they don't want to buy your product. If you're telling people you don't care about transgender kids, like, really, am I going to buy your product? I don't think so. You're going to lose business. You want to lose business? That means money. It's translating. It's that translating between these factors.
I also think that you can't recruit the smartest people if you're not embracing all people in general. But at the same time, you can't go and say, we're going to hire for these positions, which happens all the time, especially in academic settings where they want to make this statement. There has to be a happy medium where both sides realize what actually needs to be done at the end of the day to move everybody forward, not just one side. Here's my last question for you. You mentioned a talk called A Measure of Integrity. Please explain what this is and how do you use it? Because I think that adds all this up.
Thank you. I built this tool in 2000. It was a way to have a conversation inside your company and then outside your company with partners and communities to say, what are we about? So if I'm a company that wants to, comply with rules, and I'm back, I'm a lawyer, so I like complying with rules. And after Enron, everybody complied with rules. That was our modus operandi in the 2000s. So I built this model and said, okay, if your basic value is and aim is as an organization is to comply with rules, say it out loud. That's an okay thing because there are lots of rules to comply with. But if you want to do more than just comply with rules and you want to add a positive social or economic, environmental impact in the community where you're operating, then say that out loud too, and measure it and talk about it. And what does that look like and how far does it go? So a measure of integrity is a way for you to have that conversation and be clear with yourselves about what your mandate is as an organization. What I did in this most recent book was actually add a negative aspect to that because, we always talk about the good things, yes, we did these things and it was really positive, but there are lots of times that we make mistakes. Your partner may make a mistake, fail to comply with rules, may have criminal stuff. You may have partners who just go rogue on you. Even in your own company, you may have a division that does really stupid stuff and you got to rein them in. So it's a sliding scale of, losing integrity. And what does that look like from really, like minimal non-compliance, or everybody else is not paying taxes, so why would I do it? Right down the ladder, and it's a negative ladder, right down to just doing whatever it takes to survive. And I've seen all those things. So it's a way of kind of parsing through what are we really about? We're all unique organizations. We're not all the same. How do we talk about these things with our employees and with external stakeholders? So that's what that's about.
Donna, thank you so much for spending the hour with us. I really enjoyed the conversation. Love the book. Gives people a lot to think about, and hopefully they can apply that to their own organizations. And we'll look forward to hopefully seeing the next book you come out with.
Thank you so much for having me and Rex and Figment.
Have a great rest of your day and love those characters.